The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for over 10,000 years, and 17 different alien species worked together to keep peace across thousands of worlds. And when humanity finally reached space in the year 2847, they were not welcomed as friends but looked down upon as primitive children who had barely learned to walk among the stars. Ambassador Linda Cole stood before the great assembly on the station world of Valantis Prime, and her simple Earth uniform looked plain compared to the towering crystal bodies of the Sithrics and the glowing cloud forms of the Namori, and the chamber itself was a massive sphere floating in space, where representatives from every species gathered to make decisions that affected trillions of lives. Humanity asks to join the Galactic Council, Linda said with a steady voice, even though she felt the weight of all human history on her shoulders. We offer our resources and our hard work and our desire to learn from those who came before. U.S. High Arbiter Veloxen was an ancient Sithrix, whose crystal body had grown dull with age, and he looked at Linda the way a teacher might look at a student who had asked a foolish question, and his voice chimed like bells when he spoke. Your species travels through space using crude nuclear engines, and your medicine still relies on simple chemicals instead of genetic healing, and your computers still use physical parts that we abandoned thousands of years ago. He paused to let his words sink. In what could humanity possibly offer to species who mastered these things before your kind existed? Linda had prepared for this moment her whole life. We offer fresh eyes, High Arbiter, and sometimes those who know less can see things that experts miss. A wave of what sounded like laughter passed through the assembly, and the Namori representative, who was a swirling cloud of bright particles named Ephemeral Dawn, floated closer to Linda. Young species always believe their ignorance is some kind of gift, the Namori said. The Council has already solved every problem we're solving, and we suggest humanity spend its time learning rather than pretending to teach. The vote was close, but humanity was allowed to join the Council with many restrictions, and they could travel through Council space and build small colonies on approved worlds, and they could access the basic technology libraries, but they were forbidden from the restricted archives and from important meetings and from any technology that the Council thought was too advanced for them. Among those restricted things was something called the Progenitor Archive, and it was a massive collection of data left behind by a species that had disappeared from the galaxy over 50,000 years ago, and every major Council species had tried to open it at some point in their history, and every single one had failed completely. Captain Nathan Harris of the Earthship Endeavor first heard about the archive during a supply stop at Nexus Station 7, and he was sharing drinks with a Cathrix merchant who was a reptile-like being with 4 arms who had developed a taste for human whiskey. The progenitors were like gods to us, the merchant said, and his translator made his voice sound almost holy. They built structures that still stand after 50,000 years, and they could travel between galaxies, and they left behind the archive, which contains everything they ever knew. He took a long drink, but nobody can use it, and every species has tried to access it, and the data is there, and we can see it, but the system rejects everyone who tries, and some say it is broken, and others say we are simply not worthy. Nathan leaned forward with great interest. Where is this archive located? The Vault of the Forgotten in the Kessler Expanse, and it is neutral territory, and the Council keeps a research station there, but it is mostly empty now, and nobody has seriously tried to open the archive in over 2,000 years. The merchant narrowed his eyes. Why do you want to know? Just curious, Nathan said, but his mind was already racing with possibilities. 3 months later, after filling out countless forms and calling in every favor humanity had earned in its short time among the stars, Nathan stood before the archive itself, and it was housed in a building that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his eyes could see, and its surfaces were covered in symbols that moved when he looked directly at them. The Council research team at the vault consisted of 3 bored scientists who had been sent there as a form of retirement, and Dr. Vullish was a Sithrix crystal expert who met Nathan at the entrance with obvious annoyance. "Another human come to waste their time," she said, and her crystal body chimed with each word. "I've seen 17 of your kind come through here in the last 10 years, and none stayed longer than a week. I am not here to waste time," Nathan replied. "I am here to work." The archive interface was a simple pedestal with a smooth dark surface, and when Nathan placed his hand on it, he felt gentle warmth and saw lights flicker deep within, and text appeared, but not in any language he could read. "That is the problem," Dr. Vullish explained with a bored voice. "The interface turns on and begins what looks like a startup sequence, and then it shuts down, and it does this for every species, and we have studied the patterns for thousands of years, and the main theory is that the archive needs some kind of key that no longer exists." Nathan spent his first week just watching, and he noted how the lights danced beneath the surface, and how they responded to his presence, and he recorded everything, from temperature changes to tiny electrical signals. And when he was not at the archive, he was reading through mountains of research data from previous attempts. On the 8th day, he noticed something strange, and the archive always rejected users at exactly the same point, with lights that would pulse rapidly before going dark. But the pattern of that pulse was not random at all, and it was asking a question. Dr. Vullish, Nathan called the Sithrix scientist over this pulse pattern at the end, as anyone studied it as communication instead of an error. Her crystal body chimed with irritation, of course, and it was one of the first ideas tested over 40,000 years ago, and the pattern does not match any known way of communicating. "What about ways we do not know?" Nathan asked. "What if the archive is asking a question in a language nobody has tried to answer?" "Impossible, and we have records of every known and possible communication system, and the pattern matches none of them." Nathan nodded slowly, but he was not convinced, and that night he sat alone in his room staring at the pulse pattern shown as a wave on his tablet, and the shape was familiar somehow, and it nagged at the edge of his mind. Then it hit him, and the pattern was not a language at all, and it was music. The archive was not asking a question in words, and it was asking for a song. And Nathan rushed back to the vault with his heart pounding, and he placed his hand on the interface, and when the rejection sequence approached, he began to hum a simple melody in response to the harmonic question. The post. They began to hum a simple melody in response to the harmony, in response to the harmonic question. The toast. Rejection sequence paused, and new lights appeared in different colors, and they pulsed in a more complex pattern, asking another question, and Nathan answered again, adjusting his voice to match what the archive seemed to want. For 3 hours, the archive and the human captain had a musical conversation, and each exchange grew more complex, and Nathan's throat grew raw, but he could not stop, and finally, as morning came, the archive went silent. Then the pedestal transformed, and the dark surface became clear, and showed depths that seemed to go on forever, and words appeared that he could actually read. "Welcome, child of music, and you are the first to answer correctly. In 50,000 years, and what would you like to know?" Nathan stared at those words, and his tired mind struggled to understand what had just happened. And after every advanced species in the galaxy had failed, a human had opened the archive with nothing more than his voice, and in that moment, everything changed for humanity and for the entire galaxy. News of Nathan's discovery spread through the galaxy like fire through dry grass, and within days, the research station was crowded with ships from every species, and diplomatic vessels, and science ships, and news drones filled the space around. The vault of the forgotten High Arbiter Veloxin arrived on his own ship, and his ancient crystal body was carried in a special vessel designed to keep him safe. And when he stood before Nathan in the vault's entrance hall, his body chimed with barely hidden urgency. "You will share the access methods with us. the Loxan said, and his translator made his words sound like a command. This technology belongs to all life in the galaxy. Nathan had spent the days since his discovery learning to use the archive, and he shook his head slowly. With respect, High Arbiter, I cannot do that. Cannot or will not. Both. Nathan pulled up a glowing display showing how the archive worked. The archive does not just respond to music, and it responds to personal musical expression. And I've been writing down how the interaction works, and the methods cannot be transferred. And each person needs to create their own musical conversation with the system. The Loxan's chiming grew harsh and unpleasant. Then teach us how to do this conversation. I have tried. Nathan pointed to Dr. Velish, who stood nearby, looking completely embarrassed. Dr. Velish has spent 3 days trying to copy what I did, and the archive recognizes her attempts as communication, but rejects them as not real, and it is not about hitting the right notes, and it is about meaning what you sing. The Sithric scientist stepped forward, and her body's usual clear tones were now muddy with frustration. He speaks the truth, High Arbiter, and I followed his instructions exactly, and I made the exact same sounds he recorded, and the archive told me that I speak the words, but do not know the music, and it told me to return when I have learned to feel. A long silence followed, and the representatives from other species exchanged looks that went beyond their physical differences, and the meaning was becoming clear to everyone. The Council needs this technology, Baloxan finally said with a heavy voice. We have kept peace in the galaxy for 10,000 years, but that peace is fragile, and there are species beyond our borders and empires that would destroy us if they could, and the progenitor archive might contain weapons and defenses that could keep us safe. Nathan nodded slowly. I understand. And I want to help, but the archive has already taught me something important, and it will not share weapons, and the progenitors specifically kept out anything that could be used mainly for destruction, and they believed that any species worthy of their knowledge would have grown beyond needing such things. Then, what does it contain? Everything else. Nathan brought up a new display showing a list of categories that scrolled faster than anyone could read. Medical technology that could end all disease and energy systems that draw power from space itself, and transportation methods that make our fastest ships look like rowboats, and ways to make dead worlds into gardens in just a few years. And that is only what I have found in 3 days, and the archive says it would take one person about 40,000 years to see everything it contains. Everyone felt the weight of those words and 40,000 years of knowledge locked behind a door that only humans could open. Ambassador Linda Cole arrived the next week with a group of Earth's best scientists and artists and diplomats, and she met with Nathan alone before the official talks began. You have put humanity in a very difficult spot, she said, though she sounded more amazed than angry. Every species in the Council is either demanding we share everything or threatening us if we do not. Nathan rubbed his tired eyes. I did not choose this, Linda, and I just listened when nobody else would. I know, but now we need to decide what to do. She handed him a tablet with reports from Earth's government. Everyone back home thinks we should share everything freely and give open access to all species with no limits. That would be a mistake. Linda raised her eyebrows. The archive is rejecting non-human users anyway, so what difference does it make? Because humans can access it, and humans can share what we learn, and if we just give away everything at once, we lose any power we have, and the Council has treated us like children since we arrived, and they limited our technology and restricted our territory and kept us out of important decisions. Nathan leaned forward. This is our chance to change that and to be treated as equals by keeping knowledge that could help billions of beings, by sharing it carefully in ways that help everyone, including humanity. The talks that followed were the most complex in galactic history, and for months, representatives from every species argued and threatened and bargained, and sometimes walked out of meetings, and through it all, Nathan and his growing team of human researchers kept exploring the archive and carefully choosing what to share. The big moment came when Dr. Lisa Martinez, a scientist from Buenos Aires, found the archive's medical section, and it had detailed instructions for a treatment that could make any species live 10 times longer than normal, and it was basically offering near immortality to beings who currently lived only centuries. If we share this, Lisa told the gathered leaders, we change the basic nature of every society in the council, and are we ready for that responsibility? High Arbiter Veloxen's response surprised everyone. You talk about responsibility, but you assume the choice is yours to make, and this knowledge existed before your species learned to walk, and it belongs to the galaxy, not to humanity. And yet humanity is the only species that can access it. Linda replied, maybe that is not an accident, and maybe the progenitors wanted a species like ours to take care of their knowledge. The argument went on for days, but finally they reached a deal, and humanity would share archive knowledge freely, but in an organized way. And they would create a new group called the Progenitor Institute, run by humans and members from each council species, and humans would access the archive and write down what they found, and the Institute would review each discovery and decide how to share it in exchange. Humanity's temporary membership in the council was upgraded to full membership with all rights and responsibilities, and human colonies would no longer face limits on where they could go, and human ships would have access to all council technology, and humans would have a permanent seat on the High Council, which was the first new species to earn that honor in over 6,000 years. The treaty was signed on the anniversary of Nathan's discovery in a ceremony broadcast to every world in the galaxy, and Nathan himself gave the final speech 1 year ago. I asked the archive a simple question about why it needed music, and its answer changed how I understand what the progenitors wanted, and they did not lock their knowledge behind an impossible puzzle. And they hid it behind a simple truth, that wisdom without beauty is not complete, and that knowledge without feeling is dangerous. And the council species are brilliant and powerful, but somewhere along the way you stopped listening to the music of the universe, and humanity still hears it. And that is why the archive opened for us, and not because we are special, but because we have not forgotten how to feel. He paused, looking at all the assembled beings made of crystal and gas and flesh, and forms he still could not name. The progenitors are gone, but their dream lives on, and they wanted a galaxy, united not by fear, but by shared wonder. And that is what they left for us, and together we are going to make it real. The applause that followed was not human or alien, but something new, and it was a harmony of different voices raised together in shared purpose, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing could ever break that unity. But dark times were coming that would test everything they had built. 5 years after the archive opened, the Progenitor Institute had become the most important place in the entire galaxy, and its headquarters on Valantis Prime spread across an entire continent, and it housed researchers from every council species, working alongside human archivists to study and share the treasures of 50,000 years. Dr. Kevin Park had joined the Institute 3 years earlier, and he was a young scientist from Chicago, drawn by the promise of discoveries that would have taken his species hundreds of years to find on their own. And now, as he walked through the shining hallways toward his research lab, he felt the familiar mix of excitement and worry that had become his constant companion. The excitement was easy to understand, and in his time at the Institute, Kevin had helped create new energy systems that ended shortages on a dozen worlds, and farming technologies that ended hunger in the outer colonies, and medical treatments that cured diseases everyone thought would last forever. And the archive was everything it promised to be, and it seemed to have no bottom and no end. The worry was harder to explain, and it had started as a small feeling that something was wrong, and a sense that the archive's generosity was too good to be true. and over time that feeling had turned into specific concerns that Kevin could not ignore, no matter how hard he tried. His lab was in a secure part of the institute that only senior researchers could enter, and the room itself looked ordinary, with standard equipment and comfortable work areas. But what made it special was the dedicated archive terminal, and it was one of only 50 in existence, and each one was connected directly to the Vault of the Forgotten through a special link that worked instantly across any distance. Kevin sat down and turned on the terminal, and the familiar warmth spread through his hand as the interface recognized him and words appeared on the screen. Welcome back, Kevin, and you have been away for 72 hours, and I hope you are feeling well. I am fine. Archive and I just needed some time to think. Kevin paused for a moment. I have questions today, and not about technology, but about you. I am happy to talk about myself, though I suspect my answers will not satisfy you, and I was created to give knowledge, not to be understood. Kevin nodded because this was the pattern he had come to expect, and it was helpful avoidance wrapped in wise-sounding words. Let me try. Anyway, and you have been sharing technology with us for 5 years now, and medical advances and energy systems and farming methods and all of it has changed lives for the better. That is correct. But you have not shared everything, and I have mapped the categories you have given us access to, and there are gaps and large empty spaces and areas you steer us away from whenever we get close. A long pause followed, and when the archive responded, its tone seemed different and more careful. You are observant, Kevin, and yes, there are areas I have not opened yet, and the progenitors gave me clear instructions that some knowledge is dangerous to share before a species is ready to receive it. Ready in what way? That is hard to explain, so consider this question, and if I gave you the exact plans for a device that could destroy stars, would you build it? Kevin felt a chill run through his body. No, and of course not. But could you promise that nobody in your galaxy would build it? And every species has individuals who want power and who put their own desires above the good of others, and the progenitors learned his lesson in a terrible way, and they shared too much too quickly with a species that was not ready, and the result was a war that almost ended all life in 3 galaxies. 3 galaxies. Kevin's voice cracked with shock. We have never heard of anything like that. No, and you would not have, in the end. Progenitors erased all evidence of that war and all memory of the species responsible, and they considered it their greatest shame and their greatest act of mercy. And the species that caused the destruction was not evil, but merely young and curious and completely unprepared for the power they had been given. Kevin sat in silence for a long time as he tried to understand what he had just learned, and finally, he asked the question that had been building in his mind for months. Am I ready, and is humanity ready? You're asking if humanity will be the next mistake and the next species that destroys itself and others with knowledge it cannot handle. The archive's response came slowly, with each word appearing with great weight. I do not know, and I have watched your species for 5 years. Through this terminal and the others, and I have seen amazing kindness and terrible cruelty, and I have seen wisdom and foolishness and compassion and hatred and creativity and destruction, and humanity is in this way no different from any other species I have ever seen. Then, why did you open for us? And if we are not special, then why did music work when logic failed? Because the progenitors did not care about special, and they cared about potential, and every species approaches the archive with what they believe makes them worthy, and the council species brought their achievements and their technologies and their long histories, and they said, look at what we have done, and we deserve your knowledge, and humanity brought nothing except a willingness to listen and respond with beauty, and you said we do not know what we deserve, but we know how to feel, and that is the difference. Kevin leaned back in his chair, feeling overwhelmed. So humanity is not special, and we are just less proud. Pride is not the right word, and the Council species earned their confidence through real achievements, but confidence can become a wall that stops real connection, and the archive needs connection and a meeting of minds rather than a show of power and humanity connected where others only performed, and the gaps in what you share and the dangerous knowledge you are keeping hidden will stay hidden until I decide you are ready or until your species grows beyond needing my judgment. And the progenitors built me to be a teacher, Kevin, and not a library. And a teacher does not give students answers they cannot understand. Kevin nodded slowly. I need to think about this. Of course, but Kevin, I ask you to consider this question. And would you rather I had shared everything right away without any limits, and would your galaxy be better off with unlimited access to unlimited power? Kevin did not answer because he did not need to, and the silence said everything that needed to be said. He left the lab that day with more questions than answers, but for the first time since joining the Institute, the worry in his chest had changed into something else. And it was understanding, but that understanding would soon be tested. Because something terrible was coming from the darkness between galaxies, and it was something that had waited 50,000 years for revenge, and it was finally ready to strike. The council had no idea what was approaching, and they had no idea how much danger they were all in, and the peaceful years were about to end in fire and blood, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Kevin would look back on this conversation many times in the years to come, and he would wonder if the archive had known what was coming, and if it had been trying to prepare him for the choices that lay ahead, and choices that would determine whether the galaxy survived or fell into darkness forever. But for now he walked home through the shining hallways of the Institute, thinking about teachers and students and wondering if humanity would ever truly be ready for everything the progenitors had left behind. The war began not with a warning but with a scream, and it was the death cry of 3 billion souls on the colony world of Haven's Rest, who were turned to ash in a single moment by weapons that should not have existed. Admiral Grace Turner received the terrible news aboard the Constellation, which was the flagship of the newly formed Galactic Defense Fleet, and she had been getting ready for a simple patrol of the border systems because reports of unknown ships in the outer regions had been growing more common over the past year. Now standing in the Constellation's command center surrounded by officers from 6 different species, Grace faced a threat that made border patrols seem like a joke from another time. The weapon that destroyed Haven's Rest matches nothing in our records, reported Commander Zereth, who was a Catharic's tactical officer, and his forearms moved quickly over multiple control panels. The energy released was equal to a small star, and no known species has weapons this powerful. I need to correct that, said a Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who served as the ship's archive expert. The weapon matches progenitor-era technology, and specifically, it matches descriptions of weapons used in the HFY War. Grace felt her blood turn to ice in her veins because every senior officer knew about the HFY War now, and it was the hidden disaster that had destroyed 3 galaxies and nearly ended all life, and the archive had finally told them the truth 6 months ago after deciding that the galaxy needed to understand what they might face. The hegemony, Grace said, and the word tasted like poison in her mouth. Early analysis suggests they come from beyond the edge of our galaxy. Yuki confirmed. They have been traveling toward us for about 300 years using technology they found in the empty space between galaxies, and the archive believes they are survivors of a species that ran away from the HFY War, and they have spent 50,000 years rebuilding and getting ready for revenge. Grace studied the tactical display and watched the red symbols that showed hegemony ships spreading through the outer regions like blood spreading through water. How many ships do they have? Current estimates say over 10,000 vessels of different types and more are arriving through what looks like an artificial tunnel network through space. And what do we have? 3,000 council ships that can fight, and most of them were built for keeping peace and not for real war. The numbers were impossible, and they were outnumbered 3-1 against an enemy with better weapons and 50,000 years of hatred pushing them forward, and Grace had spent her whole career getting ready for difficult situations, but nothing had prepared her for this. "What does the archive say?" she asked. Yuki paused for a moment. "The archive says we have a choice." The display changed and replaced the tactical information with words from the archive itself. "The hegemony represents the failure of my creators, and they are a species that was given too much too soon, and chose destruction over growth, and for 50,000 years they have nursed their wounds in the darkness between stars and built an empire on hatred and stolen scraps of progenitor technology, and they cannot be reasoned with, and they cannot be satisfied, and they have come to finish what they started in the Erasure War and to prove that they were right to choose power over wisdom. You have two choices, and the first is to fight with what you have now, and you will lose, and they hegemony's technology is better, and their numbers are greater, and their determination is total, and within 50 years, every inhabited world in this galaxy will be conquered or destroyed. The second choice is to receive the weapons that progenitors made for exactly this kind of emergency, and these are defensive systems that can match hegemony technology and shields that could change the outcome of the war, but these weapons come with a price, and they are dangerous not just to your enemies, but to yourselves, and in the wrong hands they could cause destruction on a scale even the hegemony cannot match. If I give you these weapons, I am trusting that humanity and the council species will use them wisely, and that you will not become what you fight against, and I am trusting that you are ready. Are you?" Grace read the message 3 times as her mind raced with thoughts, and the archive was offering to arm them and to give them the power to survive, but at a cost that might be worse than losing. "What kind of weapons?" she asked. "Gravity control systems that can crush enemy ships or turn their own weapons against them, and energy shields that absorb and redirect any attack, and one other thing that the progenitors called the Harmony Protocol, and it is a system that can shut down any technology based on progenitor designs, including the hegemony's entire fleet." Yuki paused. "But there is a problem, and the Harmony Protocol would also shut down all of our archive-based technology, and using it would be like a kill switch for both sides. A last resort weapon." "Yes, and the archive says the progenitors created it after the Erasure War as a safety measure to stop any species from ever again having the kind of power that made that war possible, and if we use it, the whole galaxy goes back to technology levels from before the progenitors." Grace closed her eyes and weighed the impossible choices, and she could accept the weapons and risk becoming as bad as their enemies, or she could refuse them and watch the galaxy burn, or she could use the Harmony Protocol and survive, but lose everything they had gained from the archive. "We need time," she finally said. "Time to prepare, and time to plan, and time to decide. The hegemony will reach the core systems in about 8 months, Commander Zereth reported. "Whatever we choose, we need to choose soon." Grace opened the communication channel to the Progenitor Institute on Volantis Prime, where the leaders of the council had gathered to organize their response to the invasion, and her face appeared on screens across the galaxy, and she was a human woman carrying the weight of civilization survival. "This is Admiral Turner, and I am sending the archive's message to all council leadership, and we have a decision to make, and it is the most important decision any of us will ever face, and I will not pretend to have the answer. But I know this, and whatever we choose it together, and humanity did not earn the archive's trust by being strong or smart or powerful, and we earned it by being willing to listen and feel and connect, and if we are going to survive this, we need to remember that, and we need to be more than an army, and we need to be a family." The response was immediate and overwhelming, and from every corner of the galaxy, and from crystal beings and gas clouds and creatures, humanity had only begun to understand. The message came back saying, "We stand with you. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Galactic Council truly became one united force, and they began preparing for a battle that would decide the fate of everything they had ever built and everything they hoped to become. The hegemony was coming, and they brought 50,000 years of rage with them, that they would find that the galaxy was no longer divided and no longer weak, and no longer afraid to fight for what it believed in. The final battle took place in the space around Volantis Prime itself, which was the heart of the Council and the last defense for everything they had built together, and the hegemony fleet now numbered over 15,000 ships, and had swept through the outer systems like a disease, leaving only destruction behind. But they had not come unopposed. Admiral Grace Turner stood on the bridge of the Constellation, which was now the flagship of the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. And over 7,000 ships surrounded her, and each one had archive defensive technology, and each one was crewed by beings who had chosen to stand together rather than fall apart. The hegemony commander was a being called the Eternal Voice, and he sent a message as his fleet approached, and his image appeared on every screen in the system, and he was a creature of dark metal and pulsing energy, who had abandoned his biological body long ago. "You have surprised us," the Eternal Voice admitted, and his words carried 50,000 years of bitterness. "We expected the archive to stay closed, and expected this galaxy to be as helpless as the last 3 we conquered, but you are still insects, and you have taken the progenitor's scraps and built a bigger anthill and nothing more, and today that anthill burns." Grace did not answer right away, and instead she opened a channel to every ship in the fleet, and every world in the system, and every being who could hear her voice. "The Eternal Voice is right about one thing," she said. "We are small, and humanity has only been among the stars for a few hundred years, and they, Council species, for all their achievements, are children compared to what the progenitors were, and compared to what the hegemony has become. But the Eternal Voice has forgotten something important, and something the progenitors tried to teach us all." She paused and let the silence stretch across the stars. "Strength is not measured by what you can destroy, and it is measured by what you can build, and the hegemony has spent 50,000 years building weapons, and we have spent 5 years building bridges and connections between species that never truly trusted each other, and partnerships that have made us all stronger than we could ever be alone. And the archive did not open because humanity was powerful, and it opened because we were willing to listen and learn and feel, and we have shared that gift with every species willing to receive it." The hegemony fleet began moving forward with weapons charging and shields glowing, and Grace watched them come with her heart steady, despite the fear that whispered at the edges of her mind. "I do not know if we are going to win today," she continued, "but I know that whatever happens, we face it together, and not as humans or Sithrix or Cathrix or Namori, but as one family united by something stronger than fear." And the progenitors dreamed of a galaxy bound together by shared wonder, and today we make that dream real. The battle that followed would be remembered for thousands of years, and sung in songs and taught in schools across 100 worlds, and the Council fleet was outmatched in pure firepower, but fought with coordination that seemed almost magical, and ships from different species moved as one and covered each other's weaknesses and made each other stronger, and the archive's defensive technology held where it should have failed because it was powered by something the hegemony had not expected, which was the determination of beings who fought for each other rather than against someone ours. Became days, and the hegemony's advance slowed, then stopped, then started to reverse, and for every Council ship destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place, crewed by volunteers who had never fought before, but refused to abandon their galaxy to darkness. On the 3rd day, as both fleets stood on the edge of destroying each other completely, Grace received a message from the archive. "The Harmony Protocol is ready, and one command will shut down both fleets, and the hegemony will lose their technological advantage, and you will lose everything you gained from me, and the galaxy will reset, and both sides will have to Rebuild from nothing. Grace stared at the words and understood what they meant, and it was victory at the cost of everything and survival at the price of progress. Is there another option? She asked. There is always another option, and the question is whether you have the courage to take it. Tell me. The hegemony fleet is held together by the Eternal Voice, and he is not just their commander, but their will and their purpose and their reason for living. And if you could reach him and truly reach him, you might find something worth saving, and the species that became the hegemony was not always like this, and once they too could hear the music of the universe, and they chose to forget. But the ability is still there, buried under 50,000 years of pain. You want me to sing to them. I want you to try, and I cannot promise it will work. And the Eternal Voice may be beyond saving, and his people too damaged to heal, but the progenitors always believed in second chances, even for those who seem undeserving, and that is why they created me, and that is why they left the archive waiting for someone willing to listen. Grace closed her eyes and thought about everything that had led to this moment, and Nathan's discovery in the vault, and the negotiations that brought humanity into the council as equals, and the years of shared learning, and the archive's patient teaching, and all of it had been building toward this choice. Open a channel to the hegemony flagship, she ordered. All frequencies and no protection. Admiral Commander Zereth sounded shocked. You cannot seriously be thinking of. I'm not thinking, Commander, and I'm acting. Grace stepped forward, facing the screen where the Eternal Voice's image still floated. You said we are insects, and maybe you are right. And insects do not live very long, but in our short lives, we have learned something you have forgotten, and something your ancestors knew. Before the war, and before the exile, and before the hatred ate everything you were. The Eternal Voice flickered with sudden attention. What could you possibly teach us? How to listen. Grace took a deep breath and began to sing it. It was not just a human song, and it was the melody the archive had taught her, and the response to its ancient question, and the music that had unlocked 50,000 years of wisdom, but it was also something new, and something that mixed human feeling with the archive's mathematical beauty, and created a harmony that could bridge the gap between any species. At first nothing happened, and the hegemony fleet kept operating with weapons charging and shields raised, and the Eternal Voice watched with what might have been scorn or confusion. Then slowly the melody began to spread, and other human voices joined in, and Sithric's voices added crystal tones that made the song richer, and Cathric's joined, and the Mori joined in. Species whose names Grace could not say added their own sounds. The song became a chorus, then an orchestra, then something beyond music, and it filled the space between the fleets, carrying not just sound but meaning, and not just notes but emotion. And in the hegemony flagship something stirred. The Eternal Voice froze, and his metal body began trembling as 50,000 years of programming and hatred and certainty suddenly met something it never expected to meet again. Beauty. What is this? The Eternal Voice's words crackled. What are you doing to us? We are reminding you, Grace said, still singing as she spoke. Reminding you what you were before the war, and before the exile, and before you decided that destruction was easier than growth. And you were like us once, and you could hear the music, and you chose to forget, but choosing to forget is not the same as truly forgetting, and it is still there inside you, and all you have to do is listen. For a long moment, the galaxy held its breath. Then, one by one, hegemony ships began to power down, and not all of them, and not most of them, but enough, and beings who had been soldiers for thousands of years suddenly remembered they had been something else first, and the hatred that had held them together began to crack. The Eternal Voice's image flickered and changed, and the metal shell remained, but something else emerged, and it might have been grief or hope or simply exhaustion. We cannot undo what we have done, he said quietly. The worlds we destroyed will not return, and the lives we took will not come back. No. Grace agreed. But you can choose what happens next, and you can choose to build instead of destroy, and you can choose to join us instead of fight us. And the archive is still open, and there is still so much to learn and so much wonder waiting in. The universe and you do not have to be alone anymore. The war did not end that day, and it took months of talks and years of rebuilding, and decades of healing wounds that had grown for 50,000 years, and not all of the hegemony accepted forgiveness. And some were too lost in hatred to hear any music, but those who refused peace were contained and stopped, and eventually pitied rather than hated. But enough of them heard, and enough of them remembered, and enough of them chose to start over 50 years after the Battle of Valantis Prime. The galaxy had changed beyond recognition, and former hegemony engineers worked with council scientists to unlock new parts of the archive, and species that had been enemies now worked together on projects none could do alone, and the dream the progenitors had written into their legacy, which was a galaxy united by shared wonder, had finally begun to come. True Admiral Grace Turner, now old but still sharp, attended the opening of the new progenitor memorial, which honored both the ancient ones who left the archive and the countless beings who died on the long road to Peacehaven Park. Equally aged, but still curious, found her afterward, standing alone in